Now we're going to continue a little bit with our study of the root sources of the aerial toll house myth. And as I had mentioned before, we're going to do this in great depth, so we'll have quite a few broadcasts about it. To respond to a couple of questions, it wouldn't matter how many Protestant-style proof texts members of the toll house cult come up with. It's quite obvious and evident that the Church never accepted any such teaching. And in part the proof is in the memorial services and the funeral services. If the Church had accepted such a teaching as the aerial toll houses, and the 3rd, 9th, and 40th days were critical in the soul getting through the aerial toll houses, and the 40th day was the most dangerous or especially dangerous day for the soul, it would most certainly be included in those divine services. The funeral service would be filled with this. The memorial services would be filled with prayers to help people get through aerial toll houses. And they would be mentioned quite specifically in these divine services. In all likelihood, of course, they would have also appeared somewhere in the great canon of St. Andrew of Crete, but they don't. And somebody also wrote to me and said that they had heard that St. John Damascus in the Octoikos had taught aerial toll houses. That's absolutely false. And anyone who suggests that or says that knows very well that it's false. But the people who say they believe in the aerial toll houses, it obviously does them absolutely no good to believe in it because they don't change. They're and if you'll Google along on YouTube or other places and see the real invective, the real viciousness and hatred and malice and gossip and slander that toll housers are putting forth on the internet, you think, what good is it to believe in the aerial toll houses if you're not going to change your life? If you're not going to change the way you think? If you're not going to stop being mean, nasty, and vicious? What good is it to believe in them? And if they're there, you're certainly going to be stuck in them for doing all those things. So this is kind of certainly an hypocrisy here. But St. John Damascene wrote the Resurrection Octoikos, Saturday night, Sunday morning, Vespers, Matins, these changeable parts of the Resurrection Festival Octoikos. You will not find even the vaguest hint of anything about aerial toll houses in the Octoikos, which was written by St. John Damascene. The weekday Paraklitiki or weekday Octoikos, St. John of Damascus had absolutely nothing to do with them. They're not even a part of the real tradition of the Church. They're something rather new. They were written by unknown persons at unknown times, under unknown circumstances, and as one Greek theologian once mentioned to me, sometimes whoever wrote them crossed the border into absolute hysteria. So they're not a part of the tradition of the Church. The Octoikos of the Resurrection and of the 12 great feast days constitute the fullness of the liturgical tradition of the Church, to combine together with the Divine Liturgy. Even the Manea, the hymns written for the saints, and the lives of the saints are not part of the sacred tradition of the Church. They were also written by unknown persons at unknown times and have many contradictory and sometimes outrageous stories in them. They're inspirational reading, but they're not part of the sacred tradition of the Church at all. And it would be utterly foolish to try to take any kind of doctrine or teaching from them. Now, when we finished last time, we'd gone up to Chaldea, to Nisibis, and to that area in Mesopotamia between the two rivers. And we talked about some of the Gnostic documents that had appeared there early on. The Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Judas Thomas in particular. Now, when we look at the pagan roots of the toll house myth, we can get a reasonably good idea of where the particular strain came from. When St. Irénée of Lyon directly refuted the Toll House teaching, he was speaking mostly about Egyptian Gnosticism. Now, in Egyptian Gnosticism, there would be a longer series of toll houses, and they would have direct and rather specific moral questions, because they're modeled on the pagan Egyptian 42 gnome gods. When the Gnostics would take those stories from pagan Egypt, it appears they cut the number in half and ended up with 21. When we get the stories from Chaldea, from Babylon, and the Mandaean Gnostics, we generally have 7 astral planes with 7 gates guarded by 7 archons who try to keep the soul down. And very often in that system, it's more prayers or incantations that are said to get through the astral planes. So you have to know exactly the right prayers, the right words of the right prayers. And you can't omit even a single word of these prayers, or you endanger the soul, or the magic formulae. And of course the Mandaeans had added an 8th tier to all of this. But when you take those 7, multiply them by 3, you get 21. So when both sources were merged, you ended up generally with 21 toll houses. Now, since the 2 systems merged, one from pagan Babylon and the other from pagan Egypt, merged through the Gnostics, they seem to have merged at 21, although I've seen a system with 22, but generally it's half of the gnome gods of Egypt and 3 times the astral planes of the Babylonia. And all of these had this dangerous ascent of the soul. Now, when we start to look at the hymns of St. Abba Ephraim of Syria and of the teachings of St. Isaac the Syrian, we will find that St. Isaac very directly and very strongly condemned the Ariel Toll House teaching. And he did so because he was in that area around Nineveh where the Babylonian toll house system had entered into the Gnosticism of his area. And the Gnostics were fairly strong in the East, eventually, particularly in Armenia, because I think we mentioned before it was a buffer zone between the Persian Median Empire and the Roman Empire. And being a buffer zone, it was a little bit wild and ungoverned. So the Paulicians and remnants of Marcion and Manichaeans, Bardacian, and several other Gnostics were operating in that era. So it's very important for us in this discussion to study the hymns on the resurrection, the hymns on paradise, and the other Nisibin hymns, and the hymns that St. Abba Ephraim the Syrian wrote, because the Manichaeans in particular, but Gnostics in general, developed a hymnology which was sung extra liturgically, that is outside in the public places, in order to promote their heresies. The Mandaeans have a whole system of hymns for the dangerous ascent of the soul, for example. And St. Ephraim responded by writing his hymns. So if we look at the hymns of St. Ephraim the Syrian, we're going to see that in them he refutes anthropological dualism, which is absolutely fundamental to the Ariel Toll House teaching, a heresy condemned by a dozen of the Holy Fathers. And when you read it, you'll find that in his theology, the Ariel Toll House has become an absolute impossibility. So it's very important that we go next into the study of the refutations of the Ariel Toll House teaching and Gnostic teachings in the early church.